First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming and thank the festival for having me here. And I would like to apologize for my absolutely abysmal Spanish. They never sent me to those schools growing up, you know. They sent me to the other schools that learned this stuff, not anything that was worthwhile, you know. And now that I'm sitting here, you know, on a bima, I'm thinking to myself, it's I think the last time I sat so close to Sifrei Torah, right, was almost 30 years ago next week, which would be the 30th anniversary of my bar mitzvah. So, yeah. I can do it again for you. I remember, you know, I could keep on going. So, you know, it's stuck. So it's interesting being here and seeing this very interesting community, and especially speaking about, you know, this book, right? I mean, I wanted to. I presented this book previously in Spanish in Spain, right? And the publishers, who, you know, we can talk about them because they're not here, you know, are very, very weird people. You know, I'm glad that they publish me, but, you know, all publishers are weird, but especially when they, you know, these family publishers, you know, who've been publishers for a very long time. So, and they wanted to schedule an event in the Hall of the Inquisition in Madrid. And I was thinking to myself, this is a cool idea. Sure, you know, and it was funny. We were going in and we were going to give this book presentation, and it's a very, very weird place. And then when we were about to begin, the microphone and the amplification system died. Old building, I don't know. So I found myself in the situation of, without a microphone, having to yell in the Hall of the Inquisition. So it was like, Jews! You know? And so I feel like this book has an interesting history in the Spanish-speaking world, largely due to Benzion Netanyahu's focus on the Inquisitions as a subject of his study. And it was really through my interest in Benzion Netanyahu that I was able to kind of put this book together. And, you know, one of the things that you were mentioning about identity and about, you know, how we, you know, define ourselves, there are many ways of definition. There's the self-definition of I tell you who I think I am. Then there's, you know, the exogenic, let's say, definition where you tell me who you think I am, right? And there are also these elements of intellectual encounters in life that create us and that turn us into people that we didn't necessarily expect. And I think for Benzion Netanyahu especially, you have a man who was born in Warsaw, whose parents brings him to Palestine very young, who finds himself a adjutant to Jabotinsky and a participant in the so-called, you know, revisionist Zionist movement, who then finds himself struggling to find an academic place. And so this man who's entirely Ashkenaz, who then adopts an entirely Israeli persona and is the first real Israeli of his family, he finds his subject in the Iberian Inquisitions, in the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, and suddenly his intellectual life takes place in Spain. And because he can't get a job in Israel, and, you know, we can talk about why, he ends up going on the road and becoming an adjunct professor in the United States. And so then the Netanyahu family acquires this American side to them. And so, you know, in all of these identities, there are these accidental encounters that are intellectual encounters or encounters that come about through the necessity of immigration that create a self almost against the self's own wishes or the self's own notions of their context. And I find the same has been true for me, where I grew up in New Jersey, in Atlantic City, a little Trumpstown, a little island off the coast of New Jersey. I went to schools in Jewish schools in New Jersey and New York. I lived in Israel for a long time. I worked as a journalist in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and then I find myself writing a book that brings me around to meet, especially Jews everywhere. And I find that these encounters also definitely change my own perspective of who I am and what I think my own role is, or what my writing could mean. Something that I wouldn't have understood or even suspected when I began writing. So thank you for helping me figure out who the hell I am.
I have some questions that I want to ask you. The very first is not a joke. It seems that your book was rejected by many publishers because they don't want a lawsuit. Is that true?
Part of it was legal fears. Yeah, the other part of it was legal fears. The other part of it was the opening themselves up to lawsuits in other countries of translation, right? You know, in America, you can pretty much get away, in the United States, you can pretty much get away with publishing. And, you know, they're not going to bring a slander or defamation lawsuit or libel lawsuit against a book in the United States. That's very rare. But in the UK, which is a very large market, it's entirely different. And in fact, Israeli law is, because as a former British colony, their laws are very close to British laws. And there was a lot of concern about that. And in fact, the book was introduced into evidence in the Olmert Netanyahu defamation lawsuit. Yes, so it had its own legal future.
Were they afraid of Netanyahu reaction? Were you afraid of Netanyahu or Israeli government reaction?
No, I wanted that reaction. You kidding me? It sells so many books. Totally. Let them sue me. I mean, what are they going to do? You know, I think, you know, whenever you talk to a group in a Jewish context, there are a lot of lawyers. Sometimes in the audience, I don't know if there are any lawyers out there, but, and if so, then I apologize in advance. But in my experience, lawyers are very frustrated writers, right? And every lawyer has hidden in a drawer somewhere some manuscript of some book that they just want to talk to you about. And so when a publisher calls up the lawyers and they say, let us know if there are any problems here, it's the lawyers, it's like their dream. They have such a good time. They write these long reports about, well, if he includes this sentence, it possibly opens him up to prosecution for this. And, you know, and the problem is always asking lawyers in the first place.
I disagree on one thing.
Okay.
They are not frustrated writers.
No.
They are frustrated editors.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Talking about editors.
Yes, totally. Yeah.
Well, a more serious topic. I haven't read a word of Benzion Netanyahu. So what I know about him, about this scholar, is from your book. But there is a thesis that struck me, because I have to tell, the Spanish Inquisition was a founding pillar of Mexico, what it is today. I mean, we would like to deny that, but the Spanish Inquisition is still here, but it was stronger in the 16th century. And the thesis of Netanyahu's, the scholar, was that during the Crusade times, Christians need more Christians. I mean, they need soldiers to sell to Palestine. So conversion was a good business. It's like the state, what they need people to work for free, they need Mexicans. Yeah. And a decade after that, they need Mexicans to go back. Well, the thesis of Netanyahu is more or less the same. after the Spanish colonies in Latin America, they needed more power, more richness, so they need less Christians. So the Spanish Inquisition was a way to have more Jews and less Christians. Well, I am saying that in a kind of joke, but it's a very interesting thesis, and I would like you to tell us how do you react to these facts, and are we really to sustain this thesis today?
Well, maybe this. Do you mind if this is kind of a long answer? But this is.
It's your party, not
party,
mine.
Okay.
It's not your bar mitzvah, but it's your party.
Okay, good. So they're building now they're almost finished building a new national library in Israel, and I was given a tour of it. Right? And, you know, they bring you down, and it's in the hillside, and they bring you down, and you're going down in this hill. And of course, you know, because it's Israel, they say to you, you know, there's a vault in the bottom of this hill, and it can withstand a 40 megaton nuclear blast. Right? It's like, okay, I don't know how they know that, but they say, you know, that's not something you test for, right? But they say 40 megaton nuclear blast, and everything that's stored here will survive. And they made a list of the most important works that they were going to keep in this vault, that even after everyone is wiped out, you know, in Jerusalem, in Israel, these will survive. And on that list it's, you know, the Aleppo Codex, right? It is the Rambam, it's the only manuscript they have of Rambam, it's Dead Sea Scrolls, all the way up to Kafka's manuscripts. And the most modern thing they have is Benzion Netanyahu's work on the Inquisition. Right? Which, of course, if you want money from the government to build your library, you put the father's work in the vault with Rambam and Rashi and everyone else. Okay. So, Benzion Netanyahu is writing a book about the Inquisition that is not generally accepted by Inquisition scholars. And what he wanted to point out was the absolute singularity or difference of the Spanish Inquisition, and also the Portuguese, but the Iberian Inquisitions, as he refers to them, as different from any of the Inquisitions that came before. You know, and the difference was that in Rome, right, those were papal inquisitions. Those were the inquisitions of the Pope. And in Spain, they were regnal inquisitions. They were the inquisitions of the king and queen, right? They were led by the monarchy. And it was an attempt, in his interpretation, of the monarchy to take upon itself the powers that the Pope, that the papacy would usually have. Because there was always, of course, a constant fight between the monarchy and the papacy. So in this case, it was the monarchy taking away a privilege or a mechanism of the church and using it, in a sense, to acquire wealth and power from the Jewish middle-class merchants in order to fund their military, right? And it was his idea that essentially it wasn't about wanting converts, it was about wanting to seize Jewish property, and it was wanting to bring Jewish merchant classes closer to the nobility. And what happened was just because you turn someone from a Jew into a Christian, that doesn't mean that you get rid of who their family is. It doesn't mean that you get rid of who their friends are. It doesn't mean that if they did business with someone, they have to stop doing business with them. So what they realized is, in Benzion Netanyahu's interpretation, is they just converted people, they changed the names from Jew to Christian, but all the Jews still did business with other Jews. All the Jews were still related to other Jews, and they didn't succeed in breaking Jewish power in the way that they wanted to break Jewish power. And so it was Benzion Netanyahu's idea that it was at that point that the fundamental definition of the Inquisition changes from not a definition of conversion, but a definition of blood. So it wasn't enough that you then say, I believe in Jesus, I pray, I take the Eucharist, right? It's no longer enough that you do that. It's now based on blood. And what we have to do is eradicate the blood. And it was his idea that then linked in a sentence that I stole for the book. This is his linking of 1492 and 1942. Because in his mind, the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, was the first attempt to racialize Judaism. It was no longer a question of what your dogma is, what your belief is. It is now a question of race. And even if you say, I don't believe it, I don't care, this is not my thing anymore, it doesn't matter, because if you have, you know, how is it, the limpieza de sangre, right? If you have that, this is your definition.
Conversion was not enough.
Conversion was not enough. It had to then be generationally, you know, reproduced out of the body of the people. And he's writing this book, which is this big, 1,000 pages in English, he's writing this book. He begins conceiving this theory in, of course, the wake of the Holocaust. And he's trying to show a very medieval conception of history where it doesn't matter what changes historically. It's that in every historical period there's in a Amalek, there's an enemy that attempts to define you racially and destroy you. And so in many ways he was not a responsible scholar, but he used his scholarship in order to essentially bolster the necessity of a Jewish state. That's the short answer.
That's the short answer.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I'm thinking if I ask you some more about this topic, but let me change the subject.
Yeah.
One of the moments I like the most in the book is this conversation between the grandfather and the granddaughter, Ruben the middle, the other scholar, and the grandfather saying the granddaughter, justice does not exist. And Buddha right, the granddaughter saying, in my time, in my moment, justice helped me to understand morally my world and who I am. And the grandfather thinking of the pogroms and persecution, he's right, saying justice does not exist. This conversation between generations that is in the book is something that is important for you, and I would like you to tell us how this conversation, not between two people from the same generation, but across generations, happens about topics as important as justice and truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways that was the conversation that was happening, that I could see in my childhood between the generation of my grandparents and the generation of my parents, and I was essentially, witnessing it, right? This idea of, how much do you believe in the supposed values of your society or your institution, right? You have this idea of, especially of in the United States, of this sort of American exceptionalism, right? Our propaganda of all men created equal, right? And the idea that of certainly of an immigrant generation, of my grandparents' generation, of thinking that whoever would believe that is so naive. Then that, in fact, the first step to being killed is believing that, right? And that, how, not just assimilation, but how assimilation to the point of death. It begins by believing what a state tells you. Believing that a state says, here we believe in life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Here, all people are equal. Here, we extend equal rights and equal protections under the law to all people, all minorities, irrespective of gender, race, ethnicity, blah, 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 blah. That's the kind of thing that if it was said in front of my grandfather, he would tell me to fuck off. I'm sorry, it was just like, are you a child still? It's like, we have heard this. How many times do you have to hear this before you realize that that is the first lie? And then, of course, you have the response to that, which is, well, if we all can begin believing in it, then possibly we can avert the historical disasters that my grandparents were victims of, right? And I found myself, generationally speaking, in the United States, but even more so in Israel, right? Constantly coming up against an accusation of naivete, right? This is a very common thing, as I just said, in the United States, right? To younger people who are interested in social justice movements, of older people telling them how naive they are. But in an Israeli context, one of the most normal accusations, let's say, between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim is how naive are you? We, the Mizrahim, right, grew up in Arab countries. We had Arabs as neighbors. We know these people. You don't. You are naive. And it's this idea of political naivete and naivete that is associated with weakness that has always interested me in a subject, because to truly accuse someone who believes in liberalism of being naive is, in my mind, the first step to disaster, right? And so I wanted to investigate these two different approaches to liberalism, whether it's something that is only for the weak or the neoliberal or the bourgeois or the naive, or whether it's something that is actually functional. I think it's a primary subject of our time.
The idea of melting pot is built on the idea of integration. Integration is a different word from assimilation. The second one means that you have to deny yourself and your identity. It was hard for me to read that as Mexican, because we have not been integrated. And maybe the main question today in the States is assimilation for the Spanish community, the Mexican-American community. And I would like you that knows what is going on in American culture today to talk about that. I mean, a system was thought for integration, not for assimilation, and why there are certain diaspora that can fit in, and other diasporas, because now we are in diaspora, we are 30 million Mexicans living there. I mean, it's a diaspora that we don't fit or fit in the middle. There's a system that is fighting with this integration assimilation thing. So I would like your thought about it.
I mean, it's, I always believe that and it especially becomes evident when you come to Mexico City, right? As someone from North America, that there is this third country, and the third country is very much the border region of the northern Mexico and the southern United States, right? And the idea of integration or assimilation into land that was originally Spanish-speaking. Well, it was originally indigenous, but because we're not Catholics up there, all the Goyim up there were Puritans. They exterminated the native population, right? It wasn't about integrating a native population. It was about murdering them. Yeah, which is what Puritans do, right? And part of the irony, I think, is that a Christian civilization that is primarily Protestant, Puritan, right, is the one that speaks about integration or assimilation, but it's the one that I believe destroys more. Whereas the Catholic civilization, right, is one that doesn't speak so openly, right, about these Enlightenment values of integration or assimilation, and is able to maybe offer people, they killed people too, right? But still offer a more meaningful entry point. I think that one of the interesting questions really is in the United States is that there has not been as significant a wave of immigration from any place, right, as recently. And I think that one of the things that most Americans are, who are not of Spanish-speaking heritage are finding out, right, is that it's actually a mosaic of so many different diasporas, right? And to sit down with the Cuban diaspora, right, is to find out a very specific opinion about the Mexican diaspora. Or or to sit down with the Mexican diaspora in the United States is to find out a very different opinion of the El Salvadoran or Honduran diaspora. And I think that one of the most difficult parts is really really at this point understanding that what was sold to most Americans as a functional American dream, which is the ability to have class ascension from one generation to another, right, has not existed in 70 years, right? And that in fact, my generation of people who were born in the United States and who speak English as a native language are the first generation of native-born Americans who will have a lower standard of living than our parents. And if that is the situation for someone born in the country who natively speaks the language, then it means that the status of the immigrant is entirely one of exploited labor, right? And that to me is it's a fundamental, I think, betrayal of a lot of the aspect of the American dream that was always secretly, open secret, but secretly the capitalist dream, right? So integration, assimilation, it was never that. It was being able to earn more money and using that money to buy yourself that freedom. And I don't think that those conditions currently exist.
Now I'm going to analysis about my identity, my own identity. I have to do it today because this book, I have the intention, but I don't think that I'm going to be allowed by the publisher. Last year I went to the place my grandfather used to call Constantinople. He was born in Istanbul, and really what I wanted to know, I have visited many times, is why this Jewish guy came to Mexico. It was difficult. He came here in the 20s. He was here many times. I have some papers that say that he was one of the founders of the synagogue. And I don't understand. I couldn't understand why he decided to come to Mexico. Because half of his family, very cosmopolitan, went to Israel. They were Zionists. They went there. And the first thing that I knew there is that it was no longer possible for him to live there after the fall of the Turkish Empire. And that I realized how tolerant was the Turkish Empire the best moment. And after the fall, after the First World War, it was no longer possible to live there. At that time, the Jewish population in Constantinople was 15%. Today is 3%. Now, talking with your book, I realize again that the Turkish Empire in Palestine has a very different rule compared to the British Empire and what happened after that. Yeah. And I would like your thoughts about it. I mean, what happened in Palestine after the fall of the Turkish Empire, and why this British way to build identities or to put up identities apart change things in this region?
Well, I mean, I think, contrary to maybe my appearances, I wasn't there. So,
you are not an historian either.
I wasn't there. I can say that from my understanding, right? Because so much of the reading of these things is done through essentially the top down, right? Which is to say, writing history according to empires and the change of empires. But the truth is, the empires changed, but the people who lived in those places, they remained, right? And what was always fascinating to me was the role really of, and maybe this is because this is my own identity, right? It's the role of what we now call the Pale of Settlement, Russia, Ukraine, right? This was an absolutely enormous Jewish diaspora that was suffering, Benzion Netanyahu was part of it, right? That was suffering from a devastating wave of pogroms over, we can go back in history to Chmelnytsky, we can go, but really a set of pogroms that happens between the fall of the Ottoman Empire and British, the Mandate Palestine. And, there are a lot of people who can connect these pogroms to certain types of nationalism that is emerging in Eastern Europe, that is connected to the unrest of the First World War and blah, 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 blah. But the point really is that millions of Jews at that moment are streaming out of Pale of Settlement, which is where they were forced to live. And that's the first Yishuv, right? They're streaming to Palestine. They're coming to the United States, right? And it's really that wave which size-wise was so massive that changes the conditions on the ground in Palestine and changes the conditions on the ground in the United States. And I think that is, to my mind, one of the things that we can think about now when we talk about our porousness of borders, when we talk about, I hate using this word migrancy, crisis, because these are people. They're not a crisis, these are people. But when you talk about, waves, and waves being used to create fear, waves being used to propagandize in the press, to condemn an ethnic group, the exact same thing that you're seeing with Mexicans, but really Central Americans coming over into the United States, and the things that you're seeing published in American newspapers about those waves are exactly the same things that you saw published in American newspapers about Russian Jews coming over in the 1890s, right? It's exactly the same thing that you see that are coming around that are published in Turkish newspapers and in Arabic newspapers that are happening in Palestine at that time. And it's this using of a block of people to create a fear that a wave is coming in and fundamentally altering the fabric of a place. And it's amazing to me that we have these historic precedents and that we learn nothing from them.